Aaron Jong stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Palo Alto penthouse office, watching the sunset paint the Bay Bridge gold while his $8 billion company hummed beneath him. TechFlow had been his life for 7 years, from Stanford dropout coding in a garage to the cover Forbes with 3,000 employees and venture capitalists begging to throw money at him. His reflection in the glass showed a man who had everything: designer suits, a girlfriend who looked like she stepped out of Vogue, and the kind of success that made his immigrant parents cry with pride. But lately, something felt hollow, like he'd climbed a mountain only to find a view disappointing. The numbers kept getting bigger, but the satisfaction kept getting smaller, and he couldn't figure out why. Lauren Chun, his CFO and girlfriend of 2 years, wrapped her arms around him from behind, her Chanel perfume mixing with the scent of expensive leather furniture. She joined TechFlow 18 months ago with an MBA from Wharton and a track record at Goldman Sachs that had investors nodding in approval when she signed on. "The board wants to move up the IPO timeline," she murmured against his shoulder, her voice carrying the kind of confidence that had made him fall for her in the first place. "We're projecting $600 million in revenue this quarter, and Morgan Stanley says we could hit a $12 billion valuation if we file by September." Aaron nodded, but something nagged at him, a whisper in his mind that the growth felt too perfect, too smooth, too much like a fairy tale that couldn't possibly be real. Down in the basement level of the TechFlow headquarters, where fluorescent lights hummed and the industrial cleaning supplies left a sharp chemical scent in the air, Priya Sharma pushed her janitorial cart past the executive conference room at 11 p.m. She wore the shapeless blue uniform that made her invisible to the people whose offices she cleaned, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, her hands rough from 5 months of scrubbing floors and emptying trash bins. Through the glass walls, she could see papers spread across a mahogany table, financial projections that didn't match the revenue figures she'd overheard Lauren discussing with the VP of sales last week. The numbers were off by $120 million, maybe more, and the discrepancies followed a pattern she'd seen before, back when she had a career, a reputation, and a future that didn't involve mopping floors. She hesitated, her hand on the door handle, knowing that speaking up had cost her everything once before, but unable to stay silent when she saw the same lies being built on the same foundation of fraud. Hello, my friends. Before we continue our story, leave your like, share the story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Aaron Jong didn't remember when he'd stopped seeing the people who cleaned his office or brought him coffee, or kept the company running while he collected accolades and magazine covers. His morning started with a personal trainer at 5 a.m., followed by green juice from the Organic Cafe on University Avenue, then strategy meetings where everyone agreed with his vision, because disagreeing with the CEO who'd made them all millionaires seemed like career suicide. The TechFlow campus sprawled across 5 buildings in downtown Palo Alto, all glass and exposed brick and motivational quotes painted on walls, where employees played ping pong and attended mindfulness workshops while building enterprise software that Aaron barely understood anymore. He'd started this company to solve real problems, but somewhere along the way it had become about valuations and market share and preparing for an exit that would make him one of the youngest billionaires in Silicon Valley. The thrill of creation had been replaced by the exhaustion of performance, smiling for investors, reassuring the board, pretending that exponential growth could continue forever without something eventually breaking. Lauren had become the perfect partner for this life. Someone who spoke the language of cap tables and liquidation preferences, who looked stunning at charity galas and knew exactly when to laugh at a venture capitalist's terrible jokes. She'd transformed TechFlow's finances from Aaron's chaotic spreadsheets into polished presentations that made analysts weep with joy, and the company's valuation had tripled since she'd taken over the CFO role. "You're a visionary," she'd tell him during late-night strategy sessions, her hand on his thigh, her lips curved in a smile that promised both professional success and personal pleasure. "But you need someone who understands the mechanics of wealth creation, who can turn your dreams into dollars." Aaron loved her, or at least he loved the life they'd built together, the power couple image, the way people looked at them with envy at the Rosewood Hotel bar. But sometimes he caught her on phone calls that ended abruptly when he entered the room, or noticed her deleting emails before he could read over his shoulder, and a small voice in his head whispered that perfection was usually hiding something. Priya Sharma's shift started at 9 p.m. when the engineers and product managers filed out to their Tesla Model 3s, and the building fell into the quiet hum of servers and emergency lights. She'd taken this job through a temp agency 5 months ago, desperate for any employment after 18 months of rejection letters and closed doors, grateful for the $18 an hour that kept her studio apartment in East San Jose and her phone connected. The other janitors called her Shy Priya because she kept her head down and rarely joined their break room conversations, preferring to work through her lunch with earbuds playing podcasts about financial fraud and white-collar crime. At 32, she looked older than her years. Exhaustion etched into the lines around her eyes. Her shoulders curved from the weight of secrets she'd learned to carry alone. She'd once had a corner office at Deloitte, business cards that said Senior Forensic Accountant, and a salary that let her send money home to her parents in India while saving for her own future. That life ended the day she reported her managing partner for embezzling $8 million from a nonprofit client. Choosing conscience over career and learning too late that whistleblowers rarely get rewarded with anything except unemployment. The TechFlow offices revealed their secrets after dark, when she could read the documents left on desks and the numbers scrawled on whiteboards, when the trash bins yielded printed emails, and the recycling held drafts of financial statements that didn't match the polished versions. Priya had trained herself not to see these things, to focus on cleaning and earning her paycheck, and not ruining another career by speaking truth to power. But her mind couldn't stop analyzing the patterns. The customer contracts that showed revenue recognition pulled forward from future quarters, the expense allocations that hid losses in subsidiaries, the projections that assumed growth rates no company could sustain. She'd seen this before Deloitte, the elegant fraud that looked like aggressive accounting until you pulled the thread and the whole sweater unraveled. TechFlow's book showed a unicorn startup on the verge of massive success. But Priya's forensic eye saw a house of cards built by someone who knew exactly how to fool auditors and investors until it was too late. She told herself it wasn't her problem, that she'd learned her lesson about playing hero, that staying silent was the price of survival in a world that punished people like her for caring too much. One Wednesday night in late July, Priya was cleaning the executive conference room when she heard voices approaching. Lauren Chen and Marcus Webb, the VP of Sales, their laughter echoing down the hallway. She moved quickly toward the door, wanted to disappear before they noticed her, but Lauren's voice stopped her cold. The Q3 numbers looked perfect, Marcus, exactly what Morgan Stanley wanted to see. Another $150 million in revenue from those European contracts. Priya froze, her hand on her cleaning cart, her mind racing through the customer list she'd seen in recycling bins. There were no European contracts, or at least none that had actually closed, just letters of intent and preliminary discussions that shouldn't be counted as revenue. Lauren and Marcus entered the room, and Lauren's eyes landed on Priya with the irritation of someone who'd found a cockroach in a 5-star restaurant. "You're still here?" Lauren asked, her voice sharp despite the smile on her face. "These are confidential meetings, and I'm not comfortable with cleaning staff overhearing financial discussions." Priya nodded and mumbled an apology, pushing her cart toward the door while her mind screamed that she'd just overheard securities fraud, and that staying silent this time might send innocent people to prison. The next morning, Aaron Jong sat in his office, reviewing Lauren's Q3 financial projections while trying to shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with his company's trajectory. The revenue numbers showed TechFlow growing at 45% quarter over quarter, powered by major enterprise contracts and expansion into European markets that Aaron barely remembered approving. Lauren had explained it all in her confident way. Accelerated sales cycles, strategic partnerships, market conditions aligning perfectly with their product offerings. But the explanations felt too smooth, too perfect, like a script she'd rehearsed. He pulled up the customer database on his laptop and started scrolling through recent contracts, looking for the European deals that supposedly accounted for $150 million in new revenue. The names were there, companies he'd never heard of, subsidiaries of larger corporations, entities registered in Luxembourg and the Netherlands that seemed designed to be difficult to verify. His finger hovered over the phone to call Lauren, but he stopped himself, feeling foolish for questioning the CFO who'd transformed TechFlow into an investment banking darling. At 11 a.m., Lauren swept into his office without knocking, carrying 2 green juices from the cafe downstairs and wearing a Diane Von Furstenberg dress that probably cost more than most employees made in a week. She kissed him lightly on the lips and set 1 juice on his desk, her eyes scanning his laptop screen before he could close it. "Checking our work," she asked, her tone playful but her body language tense. Shoulders tight and jaw clenched in a way that made Aaron's instincts flare. "Just reviewing the Q3 projections," he said carefully, watching her reaction. "These European contracts, when did we close them? I don't remember the negotiations." Lauren laughed, the sound bright and dismissive, and perched on the edge of his desk like she owned not just the CFO title, but the entire company. "Darling, this is exactly why you hired me," she said, running her finger along his jaw. "So you could focus on vision and product while I handle the boring details of revenue recognition and contract structures. Do you want to micromanage the accounting, or do you want to change the world?" Aaron felt the familiar pull of her confidence, the way she made him feel both important and inadequate at the same time, special because she'd chosen him but foolish for questioning her expertise. He'd built a billion-dollar company from nothing, but Lauren had the MBA and the Wall Street pedigree, and questioning her felt like admitting he didn't understand the sophisticated financial engineering that separated good companies from great ones. "You're right," he said, closing his laptop. "I trust you." Lauren's smile widened, and she leaned in to kiss him again, deeper this time, her hand sliding down his chest in a gesture that mixed business with pleasure in a way that made it impossible to separate the two. "The board meeting is next week," she murmured against his lips. "And I need you focused and confident, not second-guessing numbers that every auditor has already approved. Can you do that for me?" Aaron nodded, pushing down the voice in his head that whispered he was being played, that trust without verification was how empires crumbled and CEOs ended up in handcuffs. That same afternoon, Lauren called a meeting with Raj Patel, the head of facilities management, in a small conference room on the 3rd floor. Priya's supervisor looked nervous when Lauren entered, clutching a tablet and standing too quickly, the posture of an employee who knew the CFO could end his career with a word to HR. "We have a security concern," Lauren said, not bothering with pleasantries. "One of your night janitors was in the executive conference room during a confidential financial discussion last night. I need to know who was working that floor and why they were still there after the meeting started." Raj pulled up the schedule on his tablet, his hand shaking slightly, and showed Lauren the name. Priya Sharma, 5 months with the company. Perfect attendance, no complaints or incidents. "She's our most reliable employee," Raj said, trying to offend someone he barely knew. "Never late, very thorough, doesn't cause problems." Lauren's face hardened, her corporate smile vanishing like a mask slipping. She was listening to private conversations about unreleased financial data. Lauren said, "That's a termination-level offense, and frankly, a potential security breach that could affect our IPO if word got out." Raj started to protest that Priya was just doing her job, that the meeting had run late, and she couldn't help overhearing conversations in rooms she was assigned to clean. But Lauren cut him off with a gesture that made clear this wasn't a discussion. "Fire her," Lauren said flatly. "Today. And make sure she signs an NDA that includes penalties for disclosure of any proprietary information she might have overheard during her employment. If she refuses, tell her we'll pursue legal action for industrial espionage." Raj's face went pale, and he opened his mouth to argue, but Lauren leaned forward with a kind of cold intensity that had made her legendary at Goldman Sachs. "TechFlow is about to go public with an $8 billion valuation," she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "We cannot afford any loose ends, any potential leaks, any reason for the SEC or our investors to question our numbers. A janitor who listens to executive conversations is a liability we don't need. Am I clear?" Raj nodded, defeated, and Lauren stood to leave, already pulling out her phone to handle the next crisis on her endless list. She didn't think about Priya Sharma again after leaving that room. The woman was just another obstacle removed, another problem solved, another step closer to the $200 million payday that Lauren had been engineering for 2 years. Priya Sharma was mopping the 3rd-floor hallway when Raj Patel approached her with the expression of someone delivering terrible news, his usual smile replaced by a tight-lipped grimace that made her stomach drop. She'd worked for him for 5 months without a single complaint, showing up early and staying late, cleaning with a precision that came from years of attention to detail in her previous career. "Priya, I need you to come to my office," Raj said quietly, not meeting her eyes. "There's been a situation." She followed him down the hallway, her mind already racing through possibilities, wondering if someone had complained about her work or if the temp agency had finally run out of assignments. In Raj's small office that smelled like industrial cleaners and cheap coffee, he handed her an envelope and a 3-page document that made her blood run cold, a termination letter and a non-disclosure agreement with language about proprietary financial information and potential industrial espionage. The words blurred together as she read, her hands shaking. Terminated effective immediately. Final paycheck to be mailed. Threat of legal action if she disclosed anything she'd overheard during her employment. "I'm sorry," Raj said, and he genuinely sounded it, his voice heavy with the guilt of someone forced to punish the innocent. "The CFO says you were listening to confidential executive conversations last night. She's concerned about security breaches ahead of the IPO." Priya's throat tightened, and she felt the familiar burn of tears she refused to let fall, the same helpless rage she'd felt when Deloitte had blacklisted her for exposing fraud. "I was doing my job," she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "I was cleaning the conference room that's on my assigned list, and Ms. Chun and Mr. Webb walked in during my shift. I didn't eavesdrop. I heard them because they were talking in a room I was literally standing in." Raj nodded sympathetically but pushed the papers toward her anyway. The termination already decided. Her protestations meaningless in a system designed to protect executives from accountability. "You need to sign the NDA," he said. "They're requiring it for your final paycheck and severance." Priya stared at the document, at the legal language designed to silence her, at the threat of lawsuits that would bankrupt her if she spoke up about what she'd heard. The smart thing, the safe thing, was to sign it, take her money, and find another minimum wage job where she could hide from her past and the consequences of caring about the truth. She'd already sacrificed one career for integrity, and the world had taught her that whistleblowers got punished while fraudsters got promoted, that speaking up was for people who could afford lawyers and unemployment, and the complete destruction of their professional reputation. But as she held the pen, she thought about the investors who would lose billions when TechFlow's fraud collapsed, about the employees who would lose their jobs and their stock options, about Aaron Jong, who seemed genuinely clueless that his CFO was cooking the books under his nose. Priya had spent 18 months broken by her decision to expose her managing partner at Deloitte, but she'd also spent those months knowing she'd done the right thing even if nobody else saw it that way. She signed the NDA because she needed the money to survive, but as she walked out of TechFlow headquarters for the last time, she pulled out her phone and opened a secure email account she created years ago for exactly this kind of situation. 6 weeks later, Aaron Jong was in a board meeting when his assistant knocked urgently on the conference room door with a message that couldn't wait. The SEC had just issued a formal investigative subpoena for all of TechFlow's financial records from the past 3 years. The room went silent, and Aaron felt his heart slam against his ribs as he read the brief email from the company's lawyers. An anonymous whistleblower had filed a detailed complaint alleging securities fraud, fabricated revenue, and systematic manipulation of financial statements designed to inflate the company's valuation ahead of its IPO. The allegations included specific dollar amounts, specific contracts, and specific accounting practices that the SEC's enforcement division found credible enough to launch an immediate investigation. Morgan Stanley called 20 minutes later to inform TechFlow that the IPO was being postponed indefinitely, and by the time the market closed that afternoon, news of the investigation had leaked to Bloomberg, and TechFlow's valuation had crashed from $8 billion to $3 billion in a matter of hours. Aaron sat alone in his office as the sun set over Palo Alto, watching his empire collapse in real time on CNBC, while Lauren assured him that this was all a misunderstanding that her lawyers would clear up within days. The SEC investigators arrived on Monday morning with a warrant and a team of forensic accountants who looked like they'd done this 100 times before. Tired eyes, cheap suits, and the weary determination of people who'd seen every trick and lie that white-collar criminals could invent. They set up in the conference room where Priya had overheard Lauren's lies, spreading out files and laptops and requesting access to TechFlow's servers and email systems. Aaron cooperated fully, believing that transparency would prove his innocence. that he'd been a victim of whatever had gone wrong rather than a perpetrator. But as the investigators dug deeper, as they started pulling Lauren's emails and expense reports and communications with customers, a pattern emerged that made Aaron's blood run cold. The European contracts didn't exist. The revenue had been fabricated through shell companies Lauren had created, and the growth that had made TechFlow a darling of Silicon Valley was built on lies that could send Aaron to federal prison for 20 years. Lauren denied everything, hired a white-shoe criminal defense firm, and issued a statement through her lawyers claiming that any accounting irregularities were the result of Aaron's pressure to meet growth targets by any means necessary. The investigators informed Aaron that he was now a target of their investigation, that his emails and his statements to investors made him potentially liable for securities fraud even if he'd been deceived by a CFO. That intent didn't matter as much as responsibility when you were the CEO of a public-facing company. Aaron Jong hired criminal defense lawyers who charged $1,500 an hour and explained in careful, terrifying language that he was facing charges that could put him in federal prison until he was an old man. The evidence looked damning. Emails where he'd pushed Lauren for better numbers, board presentations where he'd promised growth that turned out to be fabricated, investor calls where he'd confidently cited revenue figures that the SEC now believed were fraudulent. His lawyers told him the truth, that Lauren's lawyers were already telling prosecutors. She manipulated the numbers because Aaron had demanded it, because the startup culture celebrated growth at all costs, because CEO pressure created an environment where fraud became the only way to meet expectations. The narrative was simple and believable. Ambitious CEO pushes talented CFO to cook the books, then claims innocence when caught. Aaron knew he was innocent but couldn't prove it. Couldn't demonstrate that he'd been deceived rather than complicit. Couldn't show that Lauren had operated with such sophisticated deception that even experienced auditors had missed the fraud. His lawyers recommended a plea deal, a cooperation agreement that would reduce his sentence from 20 years to maybe 5, that would let him admit to negligent oversight instead of intentional fraud. The TechFlow office felt like a funeral home, with employees updating their LinkedIn profiles and investors demanding emergency meetings to understand how they'd been duped. Aaron stopped sleeping, stopped eating, spent his nights reviewing financial documents, and tried to understand where the fraud had started and how deep it went. Lauren had moved out his penthouse, and her lawyers had issued a statement positioning her as a victim of startup culture and CEO pressure, a narrative that the Wall Street Journal ran with under the headline, "When Success Demands Lies." Inside, TechFlow's collapse. Aaron's parents called from Taiwan, crying and confused, unable to understand how their successful son had become the face of Silicon Valley fraud. The board forced him to step down as CEO, appointing an interim leadership team to salvage what remained of the company, and Aaron found himself alone in his penthouse, watching his life disintegrate while prosecutors built their case. His lawyers told him to prepare for indictment, for arraignment, for the perp walk that would cement his transformation from entrepreneur to criminal in the public imagination. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, Aaron's lawyers received an email from an anonymous sender with an attachment that changed everything. The document was 147 pages long, meticulously formatted, and titled Forensic Analysis of TechFlow Financial Fraud, Evidence of Systematic Deception. It included screenshots of Lauren's emails to offshore shell companies, wire transfer records showing money moving through accounts designed to simulate customer payments, contract that Lauren had forged using customer letterheads and fake signatures, and a detailed timeline proving that the fraud had started 6 months before Aaron had even hired her as CFO. The analysis was professional-grade work, the kind that forensic accountants at Big Four firms produced, with cross-references and source documentation, and accounting terminology that made it impossible to dismiss as amateur speculation. Whoever had compiled this report knew what they were doing, understood securities fraud from the inside, and had access to documents that should have been impossible for an outsider to obtain. At the bottom of the report was a single sentence. The whistleblower who filed the SEC complaint has additional evidence that proves Mr. Zhang's innocence. Contact Priya Sharma for testimony. Aaron's lawyers tracked down Priya Sharma through the temp agency that had placed her at TechFlow, finding her living in a cramped studio apartment in East San Jose and working 3 part-time jobs to pay rent. When they called her, she was cleaning houses in Los Gatos, and she answered with the wary voice of someone who'd learned to expect bad news from professional phone calls. "Ms. Sharma," Aaron's lead attorney said, We received your forensic analysis of the TechFlow fraud. We need to know, how did you obtain this information, and can you testify to its accuracy? There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then Priya's voice came back steady and professional, shedding the submissive tone of janitor and taking on the authority of someone who'd spent years in corporate war rooms. I'm a CPA with a master's degree in forensic accounting from MIT, she said. I worked for Deloitte for 6 years specializing in fraud investigation, and I was blacklisted from the industry after I exposed my managing partner's embezzlement scheme. I took the janitorial job at TechFlow because I needed employment, and I noticed the fraud patterns within 2 weeks of starting. Everything in that report is accurate, admissible, and documented. I can prove that Aaron Jong was deceived by Lauren Chun, and I can prove that Lauren has been systematically defrauding investors for 2 years. The lawyers arranged a meeting at their offices in downtown San Francisco, a glass tower with views of the Bay Bridge, and conference rooms that still smelled like the money Priya used to work around. She arrived wearing clothes from Target and carrying a worn backpack, but when she started presenting her findings to the legal team, her entire demeanor shifted. Shoulders back, voice confident, hands gesturing to explain complex financial instruments with the ease of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Aaron sat in the back of the room, watching this woman he'd never met prove his innocence, and feeling shame burn through him as he realized he'd never even known she existed. Lauren created 15 shell companies registered in Delaware and Luxembourg. Priya explained, pulling up spreadsheets on the conference room monitor. She used these entities to fake customer contracts, with wire transfers moving money in circles to simulate payments. The $150 million in European revenue doesn't exist. It's the same $8 million being moved between accounts to create the appearance of growth. Aaron's emails show he was pushing for legitimate growth, but Lauren's private communications prove she was deliberately deceiving him about how that growth was being achieved. The lawyers asked how Priya had obtained internal documents, and she explained her access as a night janitor. The trash bins full of printed emails, the recycling containing draft financial statements, the white bars left uncovered with wire transfer details. I didn't steal anything, Priya said. I documented what was being thrown away and what was left in plain sight during my cleaning shifts. Once I filed the SEC complaint, I used my forensic training to reconstruct the fraud from publicly available documents and the fragments I collected. Everything I presented is legally obtained and admissible. Aaron finally spoke, his voice hoarse from weeks of stress and sleepless nights. Why did you help me? I didn't even know you existed. Lauren fired you. Priya turned to look at him directly for the first time, and Aaron saw exhaustion and integrity in her eyes, the face of someone who'd paid terrible prices for doing the right thing. Because fraud is fraud, she said simply, and sending an innocent person to prison to protect a guilty one is unacceptable, regardless of how that innocent person treated me. You didn't deserve what Lauren was doing to you, even if you didn't deserve credit for numbers you never actually earned. The SEC prosecutors received Priya's forensic report the next morning, and within 48 hours the investigation shifted from Aaron Jong to Lauren Chen as the primary target. The evidence was overwhelming. Wire transfers Lauren had hidden, forged contracts with customer signatures that didn't match official records, emails where Lauren had coached the VP of sales on how to lie to Aaron about deal closures. The U.S. Attorney's Office dropped all charges against Aaron and instead filed a criminal complaint against Lauren for securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to defraud investors, charges that carried a maximum sentence of 25 years in federal prison. Lauren's lawyer scrambled to craft a defense, but the forensic evidence was airtight. Every claim in Priya's report was backed by documents, by wire transfers, by Lauren's own communications that proved she'd acted deliberately and systematically to inflate TechFlow's valuation ahead of the IPO, where she planned to sell her shares for $200 million. The press coverage shifted overnight, with Aaron portrayed as a victim of sophisticated fraud rather than a perpetrator, and the Wall Street Journal ran a follow-up piece titled, "The Janitor Who Saved Silicon Valley." But Lauren wasn't going down alone. Her defense strategy became clear when her lawyers released a statement to the press claiming that Priya Sharma was actually a corporate spy planted by TechFlow's competitors to sabotage the company ahead of its IPO. The statement included allegations that Priya had hacked into TechFlow's servers, that her forensic analysis was based on stolen proprietary data, that she'd been paid by rivals to destroy the company's valuation and reputation. Lauren's lawyers found Priya's employment history at Deloitte and weaponized it. The whistleblower who'd exposed embezzlement became a disgruntled former employee with a pattern of making false accusations to destroy successful professionals. They suggested that Priya's poverty and janitorial work proved she was motivated by jealousy and bitterness, that her entire story was a fabrication designed to extort money from Aaron Zhang's legal team. The narrative was vicious and effective, with business media outlets running stories questioning whether the so-called whistleblower was actually a villain who destroyed a billion-dollar company through malicious lies. Priya watched her life being dismantled for the second time, her name dragged through newspapers and business blogs as a fraud and a liar, her LinkedIn profile flooded with messages calling her a gold digger and worse. She'd been through this before at Deloitte, where her managing partner had claimed she'd fabricated evidence out of revenge for being passed over for promotion, but this time felt more brutal because the stakes were higher and Lauren's resources were unlimited. Priya's landlord received calls suggesting she was involved in corporate espionage. Her temp agencies dropped her from their rosters, and she started receiving threatening emails telling her to recant her testimony or face consequences. Aaron's lawyers assured her they'd protect her, that Lauren's strategy was obvious desperation, but Priya had learned that truth didn't always win against money and power. She thought about running, about disappearing into another city and another minimum wage job where nobody knew her name, about giving up on justice because the cost was too high and the odds too long. But every time she opened her laptop, she saw the files she compiled, the evidence that could send Lauren to prison and save Aaron from destruction, and she couldn't bring herself to let a guilty person win. Aaron reached out to Priya directly for the first time since learning her identity, calling her cell phone and asking to meet at a coffee shop in downtown San Jose. She almost declined, remembering his indifference when she'd been fired, but something in his voice suggested genuine contrition rather than legal strategy. They met at a small Vietnamese cafe where nobody would recognize Aaron John, and he looked diminished somehow, thinner, older, his designer clothes replaced by jeans and a Stanford hoodie. "I'm sorry," he said before Priya even sat down, the words tumbling out like he'd been holding them back for months. "I'm sorry I didn't see you when you worked at TechFlow. I'm sorry Lauren fired you for doing your job. I'm sorry you're being attacked now for telling the truth I should have wanted to hear. You saved my life, literally saved me from prison, and I didn't even know you existed." Priya ordered a Vietnamese coffee and studied Aaron's face, seeing genuine remorse mixed with the kind of humility that comes from having your worldview shattered. "Lauren's lawyers are claiming I'm a corporate spy," Priya said flatly. "They're saying I fabricated evidence to destroy your company, that I'm motivated by jealousy and greed. And the scary part is that people believe it because I'm a janitor and she's a CFO with a Wharton MBA and a Goldman Sachs pedigree." Aaron shook his head, his hands wrapped around his own coffee cup like he needed the warmth. "I'm going to testify," he said. "I'm going to tell the SEC and the prosecutors and anyone who will listen that your evidence is real, that I verified every claim you made, that Lauren deceived me with exactly the kind of fraud you documented. And I'm going to make sure you get credit for saving not just me, but every investor and employee who would have lost everything when Lauren's scheme collapsed." Priya felt something crack inside her, the armor she'd built against caring about outcomes and believing in justice, and she realized that maybe, just maybe, speaking up had been worth it after all, even if the path had been brutal and lonely and full of nights wondering if she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. The FBI arrested Lauren Chin at 6 a.m. on a Thursday morning at her luxury apartment in Pacific Heights, a perp walk that made the morning news, complete with footage of her in handcuffs being led to an unmarked sedan. The criminal complaint ran to 83 pages and included charges that could put her in federal prison until she was an old woman: securities fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to defraud investors, making false statements to federal investigators. The evidence included everything Priya had documented plus additional findings from the SEC's forensic accountants, who traced Lauren's scheme back to her first week as CFO, when she begun creating the shell companies that would eventually funnel fake revenue into TechFlow's books. Her bail was set $5 million, which her lawyers paid immediately, but the case against her was so overwhelming that even her expensive legal team advised her to consider a plea agreement that might reduce her sentence from 25 years to 15. TechFlow's board called an emergency meeting and invited both Aaron and Priya to attend. A conference room full of venture capitalists and industry titans who lost hundreds of millions when the company's valuation crashed. Aaron stood at the front of the room and told them the whole truth. How he'd been deceived, how Lauren had manipulated the books with such skill that even professional auditors had missed it, how a janitor making $18 an hour had seen patterns that executives and board members had overlooked. Priya Sharma saved his company, Aaron said, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of the admission. She saw fraud that I was too arrogant to see, and she had the courage to report it even though it cost her everything. She should be standing here as CFO, not cleaning our floors. The board was silent, absorbing the magnitude of their own failures. And then the lead investor, a legendary venture capitalist who'd funded Google and Facebook, stood up and extended his hand to Priya. Ms. Sharma, he said, I'd like to formally apologize for not recognizing your value, and I'd like to offer you the CFO position at TechFlow with a compensation package that reflects both your expertise and the debt we owe you. Priya sat stunned as the board members nodded in agreement, as Aaron smiled for the first time in months, as someone pulled up her credentials on a laptop to show her MIT degree and her years at Deloitte before the blacklisting. The offer was overwhelming. $400,000 base salary, equity that would be worth millions if the company recovered, a title that would restore her professional reputation, and open doors that had been slammed shut. But more than the money or the title, it was a validation, the recognition that her skills mattered, that her integrity had value, that speaking truth to power could actually lead somewhere other than poverty and obscurity. She accepted on the spot, and the board voted unanimously to install her as CFO effective immediately, with mandate to rebuild TechFlow's financial systems from the ground up using radical transparency as a foundation. Aaron shook her hand formally in front of everyone, and Priya saw in his eyes a mixture of gratitude and something else, respect, admiration, the beginning of something that neither of them had expected to find in the wreckage of fraud and investigation. The day of Lauren's arraignment arrived with media trucks camped outside the federal courthouse in San Francisco, and Aaron insisted on attending with his lawyers to support Priya, who'd been called as a witness. Lauren arrived in a Chanel suit with her legal team surrounding her like Secret Service agents, but when she saw Aaron and Priya standing together in the courthouse lobby, something in her face cracked, the polished mask slipping to reveal rage and desperation. "You chose her," Lauren hissed, ignoring her lawyer's attempts to pull her away. "You chose a nobody janitor over me. I made you, Aaron. I transformed your company from a startup into a unicorn. Everything you have, you owe to me." Aaron stepped forward, his voice calm but his words devastating. "You built a house of cards that nearly sent me to prison, Lauren. You lied to me, to our investors, to everyone who trusted us. Priya told the truth when nobody else would, and that makes her worth more than any financial engineering you could ever create." Inside the courtroom, federal prosecutors presented evidence that left no room for doubt. Wire transfers, forged documents, emails where Lauren had coached accomplices on how to lie to auditors. The judge denied her request for reduced bail, citing her sophisticated financial expertise as a flight risk, and set a trial date for 6 months away. Lauren's lawyers tried to maintain their composure, but everyone in the courtroom could see the writing on the wall. This wasn't a case she could win, only one where she could negotiate how long she'd spend in prison. As the hearing concluded, Lauren looked directly at Priya across the courtroom, and Priya met her gaze without flinching, without apology, without any of the submissiveness that Lauren had expected from someone she considered beneath notice. The former CFO and the former janitor stared at each other, and in that moment, everyone watching understood that justice wasn't always delivered by equals. Sometimes it came from the people who cleaned the floors and noticed what the powerful try to hide. Lauren was led away in handcuffs after the judge remanded her to custody pending trial, and Priya walked out of the courthouse knowing she'd won something more valuable than any salary. The proof that integrity and courage could still matter in a world built on deception and greed. Aaron and Priya spent the next 6 months rebuilding TechFlow from the ground up, working 18-hour days to restore investor confidence and implement financial controls that would make fraud impossible. Priya brought in her former colleagues from Deloitte, accountants who remember her integrity and had quietly disagreed with the blacklisting, and together they created a financial transparency system that became a model for the entire tech industry. She insisted on publishing TechFlow's books quarterly with detailed explanations of revenue recognition and growth metrics, on having independent auditors verify every major contract, on creating a whistleblower protection system that would prevent what had happened to her from happening to anyone else. Aaron watched her transform the company with the same precision she'd used to expose Lauren's fraud, and he found himself falling in love with someone he'd once been too blind and arrogant to see. It wasn't just her intelligence or her integrity. It was the way she treated everyone with respect, the way she made space for dissenting opinions, the way she built systems designed to prevent rather than hide mistakes. They were working late one Friday night in April, reviewing documents for TechFlow's restructured IPO filing, when Aaron finally admitted what he'd been feeling for months. The office was empty except for them. The city lights of Palo Alto spread out below, and Priya was explaining a complex accounting standard with a passion that made her brilliant at her job. Aaron interrupted her mid-sentence. "I'm in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, and Priya froze, her pen halfway to the whiteboard, her expression unreadable. "Aaron," she started, but he held up his hand to let him finish. "I know this is complicated," he said. "I know I was the CEO who didn't see you when you were cleaning my office, who let Lauren fire you for telling the truth. But these past months working with you, watching you rebuild what Lauren destroyed, seeing how you treat people with dignity regardless of their title, you've made me better. You've shown me what leadership actually looks like." Priya set down her pen and turned to face him fully, her dark eyes searching his face for signs of pity or obligation. "I don't need charity," she said quietly. "I don't need you to fall in love with me because you feel guilty about how I was treated." Aaron shook his head and crossed the room to stand in front of her, close enough to see the exhaustion and weariness in her expression, the scars from years of fighting battles nobody thanked her for. "This isn't guilt," he said. "This is admiration. This is respect. This is me realizing that I spent my whole life chasing success and recognition, while missing the person who actually embodied everything I claimed to value. You're not humble because you lack confidence. You're humble because you've earned the right to be arrogant and chose kindness instead. That's extraordinary, Priya. You're extraordinary." She felt tears stain her eyes, and before she could think about all the reasons this was complicated and messy and probably a terrible idea, she kissed him. They fell into a relationship that felt different from anything either had experienced before, not the polished performance of power couples at charity galas, but something real and messy and built on shared trauma and mutual respect. They worked together during the day, arguing about financial strategy and product roadmaps, and then went home together at night to Aaron's penthouse that Priya was slowly transforming from a bachelor pad into an actual home. She taught him to cook Indian food using recipes from her mother, and he introduced her to his parents via video call, where they spoke Mandarin and cried with gratitude for the woman who'd saved their son. TechFlow's employees watched their relationship develop with a mixture of curiosity and approval, recognizing that both Aaron and Priya had been transformed by the fraud scandal. Aaron into someone more humble and thoughtful, Priya into someone who'd finally received the recognition she'd always deserved. The company's culture shifted too, becoming less about ping-pong tables and unlimited snacks, and more about doing excellent work with integrity, about building products that solved real problems rather than chasing valuations and IPO exits. Lauren Chen's trial concluded in September with a guilty verdict on all counts after a 3-week proceeding that exposed the full scope of her fraud. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning verdicts that would send her to federal prison for 20 years. And the judge added an additional 5 years for obstruction of justice after evidence emerged that Lauren had attempted to intimidate witnesses, including sending threatening messages to Priya through intermediaries. The day of sentencing, Aaron and Priya sat in the courtroom watching Lauren hear her fate, and neither of them felt joy or vindication. Only a quiet sadness for wasted talent and deliberate choices that had destroyed so many lives. The judge addressed Lauren directly before imposing sentence. "You had every advantage, education, opportunity, intelligence, and you used those advantages to commit fraud that threatened innocent people and undermined faith in our financial system. You showed no remorse, no accountability, and no understanding that your actions had consequences for anyone but yourself. The court hereby sentences you to 25 years in federal prison, with restitution to be determined based on victim impact statements." Lauren was led away in handcuffs, and Priya turned to Aaron in the hallway outside the courtroom and said simply, "It's over. We can move forward now." Aaron proposed to Priya 6 months later in the same conference room where she'd first overheard Lauren's fraud, a space they'd transformed from a site of deception into a symbol of transparency and renewal. He got down on one knee while the entire company watched through glass walls, holding a ring he'd chosen himself. Not the biggest diamond or the flashiest design, but an elegant sapphire surrounded by smaller stones that reminded him of Priya's quiet strength. "Marry me," he said simply. "Not because I need you to save me again, but because I want to spend my life with someone who makes me better, who challenges me to deserve the success I've been given, who sees the world with clarity and courage that I'm still learning. Marry me because I love you, and because you're the best partner I could ever ask for in business and in life." Priya said yes through tears and laughter, and the office erupted in applause. TechFlow employees pressing against the glass to witness the moment that had grown organically from crisis and shared purpose into something beautiful and real. They were married 3 months later in a small ceremony at San Francisco City Hall, with Priya's parents flying in from Mumbai and Aaron's parents crying happy tears while taking hundreds of photos. Instead of a traditional reception at a hotel ballroom, they hosted a celebration at TechFlow headquarters, the same building where Priya had worked as a janitor, now transformed by her leadership into a company known for integrity and transparency. The party was intimate and joyful, with employees who watched their unlikely love story develop, giving toasts about second chances and the importance of seeing people's true worth. Priya wore a sari in deep blue silk that her mother had worn at her own wedding, and Aaron wore a traditional Chinese changshan that his father had brought from Taiwan. The ceremony blending their cultures in ways that felt authentic rather than performative. They danced their first dance to a song about finding home in unexpected places, and everyone watching understood they were witnessing something more than a wedding. They were seeing what happens when people choose courage over comfort, truth over convenience, and love over everything that society says should matter more. TechFlow's restructured IPO happened on a sunny morning in June, with Aaron and Priya ringing the opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange together, while financial analysts praised the company's radical transparency approach. The final valuation came in at $9.2 billion, higher than before the fraud scandal, built on real revenue and honest accounting, and a business model that investors believed in because they could verify every number. The IPO filing included an unusual acknowledgement section that Priya had insisted on. "This company nearly failed because we prioritize appearance over reality, growth over integrity, and power over truth. We were saved by someone we'd failed to see, and we rebuilt around the principles she demonstrated. This prospectus is dedicated to all the whistleblowers, janitors, and honest people whose voices get ignored until crisis makes us listen." The stock soared on opening day, and by the closing bell, Aaron and Priya's combined shares were worth over $800 million. Wealth that felt meaningful because it was built on something real rather than fraudulent projections and false promises. 6 months after the IPO, Priya discovered she was pregnant, and Aaron announced it during an all-hands company meeting with joy that made him look 10 years younger. They were standing in front of the same crowd where he'd once been too arrogant to notice the janitor cleaning during his presentations. And now he was introducing that janitor as his wife, his partner, the mother of his child, and the person who'd saved him from prison and taught him what actually mattered. "We're naming her Maya," Aaron said, his arm around Priya's waist, after the Sanskrit word for illusion, because Priya saw through the illusion that almost destroyed us and showed us the reality underneath. TechFlow continued to grow, but differently than before. Focus on sustainable revenue rather than exponential hype, on treating employees with dignity regardless of title, on building products that solve real problems rather than chasing the next bubble. Priya used her position to create a foundation that helped other whistleblowers find employment after being blacklisted, understanding from experience that doing the right thing shouldn't cost people everything. And late at night, when their daughter was asleep and the Bay Bridge glittered outside their window, Aaron and Priya would sit together and marvel at how the worst thing that had ever happened to both of them, fraud and investigation and public humiliation, had somehow become the beginning of everything good, a love story written in spreadsheets and testimony, and the courage to speak truth when silence would have been safer and easier and ultimately unbearable.